The night my daughter-in-law laughed at me across the dinner table, I didn't say a word. Not because I had nothing to say. I am 63 years old. I have managed timber contracts in the Pacific Northwest and sat across from federal regulators who wanted to shut down a facility I had built from permits and patience. I know how to hold my ground in silence. But humiliation inside your own son's house carries a different weight. It doesn't just sting. It settles. My father, Earl Mercer, died in February. Congestive heart failure. He had been fading since Christmas, and when the call came at 47 in the morning, I already knew what it was. He was 81 years old, stubborn until the last, and he died the way he lived, quietly, on his own terms, with his affairs more organized than anyone around him understood. The will was read 12 days later in the office of a woman named Margaret Hollis, an estate attorney out of Billings who had known my father for nearly 2 decades. My brother sat across from me in a leather chair that squeaked every time he shifted. He was fidgeting. He had always fidgeted when he thought something was being decided in his favor. My father owned 2 properties. The first was the family ranch, 340 acres outside of Hardin, Montana, with a working cattle operation, a restored farmhouse, and a reputation in the county that carried more weight than any appraisal. My brother received the ranch. He did not look surprised. He had been driving out there on holidays for years, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, making comments about the fencing and the irrigation setup as if he were already measuring it for himself. The second property was something called the Mercer Mill parcel, 42 acres along the Bighorn River, downstream from the ranch. It had been a grain processing facility decades ago, but the operation had shut down when I was still in college. What remained was a concrete processing building the size of a small warehouse, a rusted conveyor frame that leaned against the riverbank like a tired old man, and a gravel access road that flooded every spring. The county had classified it as non-operational agricultural infrastructure. My father had paid the property taxes on it every year without fail and had never once suggested selling it. I received the mill parcel. My brother leaned back in his chair, and it squeaked. He said something about how Dad always appreciated that I had an engineer's eye. He said it warmly. Margaret Hollis looked at her desk while he said it. That evening, my son hosted a dinner to mark the occasion. He meant well. He had set out decent wine and made a pot roast that took most of the afternoon. My daughter-in-law sat at the end of the table and asked my brother to describe the ranch. He described it for 20 minutes. She asked follow-up questions. She refilled his glass without being asked. When she turned to me, she said with a smile that was almost kind, that at least the river property would give me somewhere peaceful to go fishing. My brother laughed. My son looked at his plate. I excused myself to use the restroom and stood for a moment in the hallway with my hand against the wall. 63 years old. Retired. My wife had passed 4 years earlier, and the grief had compressed something in my chest that never fully reopened. I had spent the years since doing what I had always done, reading carefully, moving slowly, keeping my own counsel. My brother called it being withdrawn. My daughter-in-law had started calling it being difficult. I drove out to the mill parcel the following morning. The access road was muddy from snowmelt but passable. The concrete building sat exactly as I remembered it from childhood, gray and angular against the pale February sky, the bighorn moving cold and steady behind it. I unlocked the main door with a key from my father's estate ring. The interior smelled of river damp and old grain dust and something faintly mechanical that I could not immediately name. I walked the perimeter slowly. The structure itself was sound. My father had maintained the roof and the foundation even when everything else deteriorated. That told me something. My father did not spend money on things he had already written off. On the east wall, a row of binders sat on a metal shelf, the kind of industrial shelving you find in rural machine shops. Most were operations logs from the original grain facility, decades old and warped from humidity. But at the far end of the shelf, pushed tight against the wall, was a newer binder, dark blue. The label on the spine read, USDA NRCS Word Documentation, Parcel 14 MTBHR, Active. I pulled it down and opened it on a work table near the door. Water rights easement. Those two words appeared at the top of the first page in plain government formatting. Below them, a contract number, a filing date, 1999, and a grantor line that read Earl R. Mercer. The grantee was the Natural Resources Conservation Service, an agency of the United States Department of Agriculture. I sat down on an overturned crate and read the document from the beginning. My father had enrolled the 42 acres in a permanent wetland reserve easement nearly 25 years earlier. The NRCS had paid him an initial enrollment payment and had been making annual stewardship compensation ever since, structured on a per-acre rate that escalated with federal land value assessments every 5 years. The easement protected the river corridor and a seasonal wetland on the south end of the parcel from development or drainage in perpetuity. Perpetuity. I turned to the payment schedule in the appendix. Year 1, $31,000. Year 5, $38,500. Year 5, $38,500. Year 15, $200. Year 15, $58,000, $400. Year 20, $72,000. We were in year 25. I closed the binder and set it flat on the table. I pressed both hands on the cover and stared at the door for a long moment. Then I asked the question my father would have asked in my position. Where had the payments been going? The binder did not answer that, but it told me there was an answer to find. I drove back into Billings and called Margaret Hollis from the parking lot of a diner on the main road. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had found. There was a silence on her end that lasted slightly longer than a professional pause. Then she said she thought we should meet in person. I was in her office within the hour. She had a second file for me. She set it on the desk between us the way someone sets down something breakable. My father, she explained, had instructed her to hold the easement documentation and the associated payment records until after the estate was distributed. He had not wanted the value of the mill parcel assessed against the ranch during the division process. He believed, she said, that the properties should be understood on their own terms. That was my father, in 4 words. On their own terms. The NRCS payments had been routing to an estate holding account for the past 3 years, since my father's health had declined and he had stepped back from managing his own affairs. Before that, they had deposited directly to his personal account. Margaret slid a bank statement across the desk. The holding account balance, including the most recent annual disbursement and accrued interest, was $214,000. $214,000, sitting in a federal estate account waiting for a confirmed beneficiary. I looked at the number for a moment. Then I looked at her. Why hadn't she mentioned this when the will was read? She said my father had specifically asked her not to. He wanted me to find it myself. He had told her, she said, that I would look at the binders. I drove back to the mill parcel that afternoon and stood on the riverbank for a long time. The Bighorn was running high with snowmelt, brown and purposeful. Cottonwood branches floated past in clusters. On the opposite bank, a pair of Canada geese stood in the shallows without moving. My father had known exactly what he was doing. He had not left me a broken-down facility. He had left me a river corridor enrolled in a federal conservation program that would pay annually for as long as the land existed. He had protected it from being sold by structuring it with a permanent easement. He had protected it from being undervalued by keeping the payment records out of the probate appraisal. And he had made sure I was the one who found it. My brother called that evening. He had heard from a neighbor that I had been out at the mill property and wanted to know what I was doing out there. I told him I was getting familiar with what I had inherited. He said that was fine and that he hoped I wasn't getting sentimental about the old building because a developer had reached out to him about a potential land consolidation project in the river corridor and my parcel might be part of the picture. I asked him to explain what he meant by consolidation. He explained. A development group out of Billings was assembling river frontage properties for an upscale recreation and residential project. Fly fishing lodges, private access trails, that kind of thing. They had already secured options on 2 adjacent parcels. Mine would complete the river corridor they needed. My brother had mentioned it to them informally as a favor to me, he said, because he didn't want me sitting on a piece of overgrown riverbank while a real opportunity passed by. I asked if he had told them about the easement. He said he hadn't gotten into the details. He said details were what attorneys were for. I thanked him for thinking of me and told him I would look into it. He told me the developer would be calling within the week. The developer called 2 days later. His name was Grant Parrish. He had the practiced warmth of someone who sold things for a living, and he knew how to find the right distance between friendly and professional. He told me the River Corridor project was moving quickly and that the consortium was prepared to make a strong offer for the mill parcel, land only, no structures, which he acknowledged needed to be cleared. He quoted a number. It was more than I'd expected from him, which told me he had done some homework. I asked if he had reviewed the easement documentation on file with the county. A beat of silence. He said he was working from the county assessor's classification, which listed the parcel as non-operational agricultural infrastructure. I told him there was a permanent USDA NRCS wetland reserve easement on the property, filed in 1999 and fully active, which placed the entire 42 acres under federal protection in perpetuity. No development, no drainage, no alteration of the river corridor or wetland areas, permanent and binding on any future owner. The warmth left his voice the way heat leaves a room when a window opens in winter. He said he would need to have his attorney review the filing. I told him the contract number was in the county records and wished him a good afternoon. He did not call back. My brother called the following morning. He wanted to know what I had said to the developer. I told him what I had told Grant Parrish. My brother said I should have mentioned the easement earlier, that it complicated everything, and he had been working on this relationship with the developer for weeks. I asked him when exactly he had been planning to mention the easement to the developer himself. He said he hadn't known the full details. I told him I understood. He asked if the easement could be dissolved. I told him permanent meant permanent. A USDA wetland reserve easement cannot be vacated by a private landowner. The only entity that can modify the terms is the federal government, and they do not do so for residential development projects. He said that was a problem. I told him I did not see it as a problem. He went quiet in a way that I recognized. It was the same quiet he had used when we were children and an argument wasn't going in his direction, a gathering silence before he tried another approach. He said that if the parcel was protected and undevelopable, then its market value was essentially zero, and I should consider whether it made sense to simply deed it over to a land trust and take the charitable deduction. I told him I would think about it. What I did not tell him was that I had already spoken with Margaret Hollis again and confirmed that the annual NRCS compensation payments, which would continue indefinitely, were mine to receive as the enrolled landowner. That the $214,000 in the estate holding account was mine to claim once I filed the beneficiary confirmation paperwork, which I had already begun. That the easement did not diminish the property's value. It secured a revenue stream tied to federal conservation funding that adjusted with land assessments every 5 years. What I did not tell him was what that number was now, in year 25. I filed the beneficiary confirmation with Margaret's help and contacted the NRCS field office in Billings directly. The program officer assigned to the Mercer parcel was a careful, methodical woman who pulled up the file within minutes and confirmed that the property had been continuously enrolled since 1999 and that payments were current in the holding account. She told me the current annual disbursement rate, based on the most recent 5-year land value assessment, was $94,000 per year. $94,000 per year. Escalating. She asked if I planned to continue enrollment. I told her I did for as long as the program existed. She said that was a sound decision and that the Bighorn Corridor properties were among the highest value enrollments in the state given the combination of wetland acreage, river frontage, and proximity to federal designated waterways. I thanked her and drove back to the mill parcel. I sat inside the concrete building on the same overturned crate and looked at the binder on the table in front of me. The river was audible through the walls, a low, continuous sound that had been there for a century before my father bought the land and would be there long after I was gone. The building smelled the same as it had the first morning I came out here. Damp, mineral, old. My father had maintained the roof not out of sentiment. He had maintained it because he wanted the binders to survive. My brother came out to the parcel and announced 3 days later, He drove up in the truck he used for the ranch and stood outside the building with his jacket collar turned up against the March wind. I let him in. He walked the interior without speaking, the way people walk through places when they are trying to find something wrong with them. He sat down across from me. He said he had been thinking about what was fair. He said that when Dad divided the estate, he hadn't fully understood what was on this parcel, and he thought a reasonable adjustment could be made between us. He proposed a 50-50 split of whatever annual income the easement generated. I asked if he had read the easement documentation. He said he had looked at it. I asked if he had seen the enrollment structure, the perpetual term, and the beneficiary provisions. He said he had seen the general terms. I asked him what he thought a 50-50 split arrangement would be based on, legally, given that the parcel and its associated federal enrollment had been deeded to me outright by our father and confirmed through probate. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He said we were brothers and he thought we ought to handle this between ourselves. I told him I agreed that we were brothers. I told him that our father had made a deliberate choice about how to structure the estate, that he had spent years protecting this particular asset from being subdivided or diluted, and that I intended to honor what he had built. My brother's face moved through several expressions before it settled. He said Dad had always favored me. I let that sit in the air for a moment without responding. He knew, the same as I did, that what he was describing was not favoritism. It was preparation. Our father had given the ranch to the son who wanted the ranch. He had given the mill parcel to the son who would read the binders on the shelf. My brother stood and walked to the door. He looked out at the river. It was running cleaner now, the snow melt thinning, the water shifting from brown toward a pale green-gray. He stood there for a while. He said quietly that he had been counting on the land consolidation deal to cover a loan he had taken on the ranch. Equipment financing. He had assumed the mill parcel sale would be a straightforward transaction and had moved faster than the numbers allowed. I understood then why he had been so eager with the developer. It wasn't entirely greed, it was pressure. He had built a picture in his mind of how the inheritance would land and had already borrowed against it. I told him I was sorry he was in that position. I told him that was not something I had caused, and it was not something I could solve by signing away what our father had spent 25 years building. He nodded once and left. I stayed in the building until the light shifted. The river sound filled the room. The blue binder sat on the table. I thought about my father driving out here in all weather for 2.5 decades, paying the taxes, maintaining the roof, keeping the records straight. He had never mentioned the easement to me directly. Not once. I have thought about why, and I believe I understand it. He knew that if he told me, I would have carried it like a responsibility. He wanted me to find it like an inheritance. There is a difference. Responsibility is given. Inheritance is discovered. My son called that evening. He had heard from his uncle about the easement situation. He was careful on the phone, trying to understand what had happened without taking sides, which was his nature, and which I have always respected. I explained the property structure to him the way I would explain it to anyone, plainly, with the specific details in the correct order. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he thought his uncle had probably not read the documents. I told him that was accurate. He asked what I was going to do with the parcel. I told him I was going to maintain the enrollment, receive the annual compensation, and begin renovating the concrete building for my own use, possibly as a base for a small consulting practice, possibly just as a place to keep my father's binders in order. My son laughed. It was a real laugh, not polite. He said that sounded exactly like something Grandpa would have done. I told him it was. My daughter-in-law called the following Sunday. She did not begin with pleasantries. She said she understood there had been a complicated situation with the property, and that she and my son had been talking, and she wanted to say that she hoped things resolved smoothly for everyone in the family. Her voice was careful in the way voices get when someone is approaching something from an angle. I told her I appreciated that. She said she had always thought the mill parcel seemed like a challenging inheritance, and she was glad it had turned out to have some value attached to it. I told her it had always had value. The challenge had simply been finding someone willing to read the paperwork. She did not say much after that. The NRCS released the estate holding account balance in April, $214,000, transferred to my account in a single disbursement. The annual payments resumed on the new schedule, routed directly to me as confirmed beneficiary. $94,000 per year, with the next assessment cycle in 3 years. I did not tell my brother the exact number. He had not asked, and I had learned from my father that unsolicited financial information rarely helps anyone. I hired a contractor to assess the concrete building. He told me the structure was exceptionally sound for its age. Thick walls, good drainage, a roof that had been resealed within the last decade. He asked who had been maintaining it. I told him my father. He said whoever it was had known what they were doing. In May, I drove out to the parcel early on a clear morning and walked the entire perimeter of the 42 acres for the first time. The wetland on the south end had dried slightly from the spring drawdown, and the sedge grass was coming in thick and green along the edges. The river ran along the eastern boundary, unhurried and cold and permanent. A great blue heron stood motionless on a gravel bar 20 feet from the bank, watching the current. I stood at the corner of the property where the original survey stakes had been replaced with aluminum NRCS boundary markers, and looked down the length of the river corridor. The cottonwoods were leafing out. The air smelled of cold water and early grass. My father had stood in this exact spot 25 years ago and decided that this land was worth protecting. Not selling, not developing, not leveraging against something else. Protecting. He had signed a permanent agreement with the federal government and walked away from the short-term market value and kept paying the taxes and kept the binders current and trusted that someone would eventually understand what he had done. I understood what he had done. My brother called in June. His voice had lost the edge it carried in March. The equipment loan situation had resolved. He had renegotiated the terms with the bank, and the ranch was operating well enough to cover it. He did not apologize directly. That was not his way. But he asked how the mill parcel was coming along, and his tone was genuine, and I answered him genuinely. We talked for a while about our father. About the winter he repaired the feed barn roof himself in temperatures that had no business allowing outdoor work. About the way he kept every receipt, every contract, every filing in labeled binders on metal shelves. About how we had both assumed when we were young that this was simple orderliness, and how we understood now that it was something else entirely. It was a form of communication. He said what he needed to say in documents and maintenance schedules and easement filings. He trusted that his sons would eventually be fluent in the language he spoke. I had been paying attention. That was the difference. I began renovation of the building in July. The contractor framed out a small office on the east side, facing the river, with 2 large windows that I had cut into the original concrete wall. It was painstaking work and expensive, but the walls were built to last another 100 years, and I saw no reason not to use them. I had the metal shelving cleaned and re-anchored, and moved the binders from the work table to their proper place. A colleague from my consulting years reached out that fall about a wetland mitigation contract in the region. He knew I had a background in land use and federal permitting and was looking for someone to review documentation on a set of agricultural properties being considered for conservation enrollment. I told him I was familiar with the process. We signed an agreement in October. The office faces the river in the morning. The heron comes back to the same gravel bar 2 or 3 times a week, standing with that unhurried patience that herons have, watching the water for what it will bring. The cottonwoods along the bank have lost their leaves now, and the river is visible for a long distance in both directions, brown and serious and constant. My father's binders are on the shelf in the order he kept them. The blue one, the most recent, sits at the end within reach. I have added 2 of my own since the summer. New correspondence with the NRCS, updated payment records, the contractor's structural report, the consulting agreement. The shelf is not full. My brother came out to see the finished office in November. He stood at the window for a long moment and looked at the river without saying much. Then he looked at the binders and looked at me, and I could see him doing the calculation. Not of money, but of time. How long our father had been keeping these records. How many winters he had driven out here alone to check the roof and keep the paperwork current. He said quietly that he hadn't known. I told him Dad had known that too. We drove back into town together and had dinner at a place on the main road that my father had liked. We talked about the ranch and the consulting work and the way the Bighorn had run in October, low and clear, which the county extension office said was unusual for the season. We talked about things other than money, which is what men our age can sometimes manage when the pressure has finally lifted. On the drive back, he said he was sorry for the things he had said in March. I told him I had forgotten them, which was not entirely true, but was close enough to be useful. I drove home through the dark and parked in my driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet truck cab. The stars were bright and hard and cold the way they get in Montana in November, when the air has no moisture left in it and nothing stands between you and the distance. My father had left me 42 acres and a concrete building and a row of binders on a metal shelf. He had left me a river. He had left me a contract with the federal government that would pay his name's land in perpetuity, long after both of us were gone. He had left me the thing he trusted most, not property, not money, but language. Documented, specific, irrefutable language that rewarded the person willing to read it. I had been reading carefully my entire life and had been told, more times than I can count, that this was a small way to live, that real success announced itself, that the men worth knowing were the ones who moved fast and built loud and left visible marks on the world. My father had moved quietly along a river in Montana for 81 years. He had left a mark that a federal agency will honor for as long as the Bighorn runs. He had trusted me to find it. I was not going to let him down. If you have ever been the one in the room who reads the footnotes while everyone else reads the headlines, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from tonight? What did someone trust you to find? We tell stories here about steady hands and long patience, about the value that lives below the surface of things. If that is the kind of story you want more of, stay with us. There is always more beneath what's visible. You just have to be willing to look.